Give me liberty or give me death. You've probably seen that on a bumper sticker stuck to the back of an F-150 recently. But it turns out the guy who uttered that phrase is more complicated than we give him credit for. Today, we're talking about Patrick Henry and why this avowed anti-federalist came out in support of the government just before his death. This is Too Complicated for History.
Hey everybody, today we have with us Dr. John Ragosta, historian and fellow for the Virginia Humanities. He's also the author of the book, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. Thanks for being here with us today, John.
Thank you for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about this because I've done a lot of studying of Patrick Henry. I worked at his Scotchtown home giving tours for several years. So that was a lot of fun. And I want to start out with a question about just how we look at politics. And I think there is... Today, you tend to see people thinking in terms of, well, it was never this bad, or, oh gosh, it's so horrible. This is just the worst that it's ever been, with perhaps the exception of the Civil War, because at least you can say, well, we're not that bad yet. But what your book talks about is that actually we could have come to a civil war a lot earlier than the 1861 one that we know about in the 1790s, and that there was quite a bit of hyperpartisanship back then, too. So how close did we really come to a civil war, or maybe just the nation falling apart in the 1790s?
Well, Lynn, it's a very good question, and hyperpartisanship is the correct word. I mean, we could talk about the comparison to today. I think that's more difficult. But the nation was new. I mean, we tend to think of the United States as having been around for hundreds of years. In the 1790s, the nation was new, and they really didn't know quite how to work things. And when the founders designed the country, they had not anticipated a two-party system. They had not anticipated parties really at all. And so when you get into the 1790s, and interestingly enough, foreign affairs initially caused the split between different groups. You have these two parties developing, and they go at it, and they go at it more, and it starts to get almost violent. I mean, there are reports at the end of the 1790s, and the book picks up with this. I think it's the beginning of the introduction. They were really worried about civil war. There were newspapers, dozens of newspapers all over the country were civil war. And the idea that we were going to have state against state, states against the federal government. There were reports that Virginia was buying arms for a possible conflict with the federal government. So yes, it was absolutely a very real concern, and we've sort of missed this. This whole episode has sort of been forgotten.
Yeah, that's interesting, because even in the general sort of consciousness, I think that period, the struggle was, I guess, the revolution. That was the battle, and then the Constitution sort of fixed the problems that we had in between those two periods, right after the revolution. But I don't think in my sort of cursoral sort of like standard American historical education, did I hear about a lot of conflict in the early constitutional era. Like I don't think that it was sort of brushed over almost entirely, I guess, and especially if it was as bad as you're saying.
Well, and we can talk about that, because again, I think it was actively forgotten. People didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
But it really culminates. People have heard about the Alien and Sedition Act.
Mm-hmm.
And that was bad. It literally becomes illegal to criticize the president or the Congress of the United States. And I always tell people, by the way, you could say whatever you want about the vice president. Vice president was Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson.
That was the other party. That was back when the president and the vice president were opposite parties.
Sure.
And, so we know this Alien and Sedition Act was bad. And it was a violation, we would certainly think, of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But we've underestimated, first of all, the severity. History has said for hundreds of years, you can go look at books, they said, well, 14 people were prosecuted, 12 people were convicted. In fact, scores of people were prosecuted. And they were specifically targeting their political enemies, editors of newspapers. So the editors of the Democratic Republican newspapers were being targeted by the Federalists, who were in control of both the presidency and Congress. And I think the other reason we've forgotten about this is that most histories have the Alien and Sedition Act, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison oppose them with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And lo and behold, Jefferson is elected president in 1800.
Right.
But that's very misleading. In fact, the Jeffersonians got their butts kicked in the midterm election. They really got shellacked in the midterm election after the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And that's when Washington and George Washington and Patrick Henry come out in opposition to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, which is extraordinary. And we have this conflict. And it really continues up to the election of 1800.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. That's patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show.
It's such a fascinating time. And before we get too far into it, I'd like to step all the way back and maybe introduce Patrick Henry, because I think a lot of people know his name, and they probably know him by one phrase: "Give me liberty or give me death." That's all. That's what we know about him.
I've seen it on a lot of T-shirts. Yeah, it's catchy.
Exactly. Yeah, he could have had his own T-shirt company.
It was catchy then too. They loved it.
Yeah.
And so, could you give us a little bit of background on Patrick Henry politically, that sort of gets us up to the point where we get to this crisis where Patrick Henry sort of comes out of retirement or steps back in to help with the story?
Right. Lynn, no, it's a good point, because you're right. Most Americans, if they know anything about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. But in fact, after that speech, and that's an important speech, it really rallies the patriots to stand up to Britain. He becomes the first governor in Virginia. He's critical in supplying the troops at Valley Forge. He's critical in revealing the Conway cabal, which was trying to get George Washington fired as general. And then, and this is the critical piece, after the revolution ends and we have the Constitutional Convention, Patrick Henry becomes the leading anti-Federalist. And again, we think the Constitution, everybody loves the Constitution. Well, no, not at the time. In 1788, when the ratification debates are going on, it was really a close call. The Constitution was almost not ratified. And Patrick Henry leads the effort to oppose that, to oppose ratification. He says, look, this government's going to be too powerful. It's going to be too distant from the people. It's going to interfere with the states. We need to oppose this effort of creating a consolidated government. But then that's the critical point, and this is the link between 1788, when he's involved in opposing ratification, and 1799, when he comes out of retirement. We'll get to that. But the critical link is when he loses that vote, Virginia agrees to ratify, and Virginia was the largest state, the most populous state. It's clear the Constitution is going to be ratified. There's an effort to continue to oppose implementation of the Constitution. George Mason leads an effort to basically block implementation. Says, we're not going to tolerate this. Henry says, no, that's not the way we behave in a republic. I will continue to oppose the Constitution, but I will do so in a constitutional way. That's his phrase, in a constitutional way. He tells the Anti-Federalists, go home, live within the system that was adopted. We voted against it, but we, the people, endorsed it, and we've got to live with what we, the people, agreed to. And so Henry really makes this remarkable statement in 1788, and it's what he's going to come back to in 1799, of what it means to be a loyal opposition. You don't have to agree with the government in a democracy, in a republic, but you do have to live within what the majority decides. And so that's really a part of Patrick Henry that we've forgotten. We think he's some kind of firebrand. He's a crazy libertarian. Well, no, he's really a person who supports the community's right to decide issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was going to ask it. The way you described him being the leading anti-federalist, then I'm sure we'll get to it, but that's a pretty different stance than coming out against Jefferson 10 years later. So I'm
Right.
very curious to sort of parse through that journey and how we get there, because that's a pretty big leap.
Right. And the critical point, Isaac, is that as an anti-federalist, Henry really defines the states' rights movement. In a lot of ways, he's the intellectual godfather to the states' rights movement. And it's Jefferson and Madison who pick up that mantle in the 1790s, the new Democratic Republican Party, the Jeffersonians. They really take on Patrick Henry's arguments about states' rights. And they say, look, the federal government's becoming too powerful, too distant from the people. Sounds an awful lot like Patrick Henry. But then we get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it really goes too far. So Jefferson, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, drafts the Kentucky resolutions that I referred to before. And everybody has sort of heard of the Kentucky resolutions, but we forget how radical it was. Jefferson's desperate. They're throwing people in jail for opposing the government. And so in the Kentucky resolutions, he suggests that the states may nullify, that's his term, may nullify federal legislation that they believe to be unconstitutional. Well, of course, that term rings in our ears because we remember the nullification crisis. Nullify is going to become the favorite word of the fire eaters in the South in the lead up to the Civil War. And it's Jefferson who first comes forward with that idea and says individual states have their own sovereignty. They can oppose federal laws. And that's what brings George Washington and Isaac, as you say, remarkably, Patrick Henry, the godfather of the states' rights movement, out of retirement.
So I think one of the things that really struck me in your book was when you talk about the difference between the give me liberty or give me death speech, so that time period, and the time period after the Constitution was written. And it was about representation. And that's why Patrick Henry had sort of reacted differently to Britain versus the US government, which was representation.
Absolutely. So when he retires after the Constitution's ratified, he retires, and he's offered positions. Washington offers him Supreme Court Justice, Secretary of State. He's offered senator. He's offered ambassador to France and Spain. And he says, no, I'm retired. I didn't support this government. You all run the government. But then when Jefferson and Madison come out with this idea of nullification, and that the states are independent authorities in a compact and therefore can secede from the Union, Henry comes out and he makes, and I always find this interesting, and you were alluding to it a moment ago. We remember the give me liberty or give me death speech.
Yep.
But then he makes this really wonderful, his final political speech on March 4th, 1799 at Charlotte Courthouse. And it's the same Patrick Henry, but it's a very different message. And he says, look, I opposed this. I told you people this was going to happen. I told you the federal government was going to be powerful. They were going to interfere with our rights. But we agreed. And you have to live within what we agreed to. Mm-hmm. And, he really goes after Jefferson and Madison. And he warns them. He says, if Virginia goes down this route, they're going to face the federal government. And George Washington is going to ride into Virginia with a federal army, George Washington on his white horse. And there's this wonderful episode where he says, who would dare to oppose George Washington, who had led them to victory? And so on. Well, it's an 18th century election. People have been drinking. There's a drunk in the audience. We actually know who it is. It's a guy named John Harvey. Who would dare to oppose George Washington? I would. Well, Henry just turns at him, rises. You dare not do it in such a parricidal attempt. Parricidal, father of our country. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel will drop from your nerveless arm. And he explains to the people, he says, look, Congress, and I was looking at the speech again this morning. This is a remarkable statement. He says, Congress is our representatives the same way as our state legislatures are representatives. Mm-hmm. And I think about today how some people try to convince us the federal government is the enemy. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what was happening. And Henry says, no, they're not the enemy. The Congress, we elect them. They're our representatives. I maybe didn't vote for him. The majority may have decided against me because in a republic, in a democracy, I don't know about you, the people I vote for don't always win. Well, what do you do? And he says, there are representatives. And then he really concludes with this remarkable statement. He says, look, if we can't live with the Constitution that we agreed to, the only option is a monarchy. You may bid adieu forever to representative government. You can never exchange the present government, but for a monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that, look, you can oppose the government, but you do so, again, his phrase, in a constitutional way. But when Jefferson and Madison have now brought up this idea of nullification,
Right.
clear violation of the Constitution Supremacy Clause, they brought up the idea that states can secede. And again, there were newspaper articles talking about Virginia and Kentucky are going to secede from the Union. He said that goes too far. I'm a states' rights guy.
Yeah.
But that goes too far. So, again, I think we probably ought to remember that March 1799 speech as much as we remember the March 1775 speech.
Absolutely.
So here's a question. How was it received generally?
Well, there's a wonderful episode. People listen. This is Patrick Henry. And again, we've tended to forget Patrick Henry. He is the second most popular politician in Virginia, bar none. Only George Washington is more popular than Henry. I mean, Henry is elected governor 6 times in Virginia. He declines the 6th time. He says, no, I'm old, I'm retired. He's far more popular than Jefferson and Madison at the time.
Sure.
And so for Patrick Henry, and everybody knows he was the leading Anti-Federalist. They know he was the one saying the federal army is going to be too powerful. So this message was very powerful. And I think a couple of things, Isaac, to your question, a couple of examples. So in January of 1799, President Adams, John Adams as president, had suggested that Patrick Henry could be the new ambassador to France to try to have peace negotiations with France. And the Aurora, which was the leading Democratic Republican newspaper, the leading Jeffersonian newspaper, said, that's great. Patrick Henry is a great patriot. Everybody loves Patrick Henry. We feel more confident with Patrick Henry representing us in France. After he makes this speech, the Jeffersonian newspaper, the Aurora, comes out and says he's senile. And they basically make a fart joke about Patrick Henry. I mean, they're making fart jokes about Patrick Henry. He passes his wind. So they realize this is powerful. George Washington and Patrick Henry have come out of retirement to oppose Madison and Henry, or to oppose Madison and Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that happens is Henry supports several Federalists for election to Congress. Among them, John Marshall. And it's that John Marshall. It's the Chief Justice John Marshall. And he wins a very close election, and almost certainly he wins it because Patrick Henry endorses him, because he's a Federalist opposing the Jeffersonians. I wonder, in the next 36 years, I guess Jefferson dies 27 years later, but in all of those years, when John Marshall was being a pain in the tuchus for Thomas Jefferson, does he remember Patrick Henry is responsible for that guy getting elected to office? So his voice carries a lot of weight. And in fact, in the book, when I was writing the book, I came across a letter very late. The book had already basically gone to print. And I called the publisher and said, you've got to stop the presses, which of course,
stop the presses.
Publishers do not want to do it. And I said, look, this is it will be a very small change, but I need to put this in. I found a letter from Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush is one of those guys, he's everywhere in the early Republic. He knows everybody. He writes Thomas Jefferson in March of 1801, right after Jefferson is inaugurated. And he says, gee, Mr. President, do you remember 2 years ago, 1799, just when Henry's making this speech, you remember 2 years ago, you told me that if Patrick Henry and George Washington died, your election would be far more quick and far more certain. And of course, both Patrick Henry and George Washington died. And so Jefferson knew that Henry's voice was going to be very important. John Randolph of Roanoke, he's another one of these people who we've all heard of. He's around in the early Republic. He says very clearly that if Henry had lived, Thomas Jefferson would have never been elected president.
Huh.
So yeah, he's having an impact.
I didn't even think about the dynamic that all four of them are Virginians. This was all like Virginian on Virginian violence taking place. But I guess that it makes it more powerful. That it's
and it's critical to another issue, that states' rights in the 19th century is going to become all about slavery.
Right.
It's all about slavery in the 19th century. That wasn't the issue in the 1790s. Each one of these guys is a slave owner, and it was all in Virginia. And so it really was about, can this idea of states' rights go too far? And I do think I should say, I mean, I've been picking on Mr. Jefferson. A remarkable thing happens. What we want politicians to do, we want them to sometimes change their minds if they make mistakes. Of course, they can't admit that I made a mistake.
No,
we wouldn't want to do that.
It's not allowed.
So, 8 days after the Virginia resolutions were adopted, Virginia resolutions written by James Madison, much more mild than Jefferson's nullification Kentucky resolutions, but still suggesting the states can interpose, Madison's term, between the federal government and the people. 8 days after those resolutions were adopted, Madison writes Jefferson saying, maybe we went too far. We're going to be accused of usurping authority under the Constitution in the very act of complaining about the federal government usurping authority with the Alien and Sedition Act. And what makes that amazing is, first of all, Madison is complaining about the words he wrote. They're his words. And second, the Kentucky or the Virginia resolutions were much more mild about the Kentucky resolutions, and Jefferson knows this. So he's getting Madison's letters, and Madison's saying, look, Mr. Jefferson, I went too far. Well, you, Mr. Jefferson, went way too far. And so Jefferson and Madison really pull back. They stop talking about nullification. You don't see Jefferson talking about nullification. They're starting to talk about the federal government's too powerful. We've got to cut that back in the federal government. The government's interfering with our free speech rights. Madison's going to spend the rest of his life, he dies in 1836, denying that he and Jefferson had ever suggested nullification. Well, in fact, they had. But Madison is trying to say, no, we didn't. And, for 200 years, people have been saying Thomas Jefferson as president was a hypocrite because he doesn't do what he was saying in the 1790s he would do.
Right.
Well, there's another possible explanation. He realized what they were talking about in the 1790s was crazy.
Right. Grew up a little bit.
And Lynn's the hyperpartisanship almost destroyed the country. And so I think what we really see in Jefferson and Madison's, Jefferson's presidency in particular, is Jefferson chagrined, really pulling back and saying, the country is fragile. The Union is important. And this is his first inaugural address. We are all Republicans. We are all we're all Federalists. And we are all Republicans. Excuse me. And says, we have to unite for the common good. So I think they realized they had gone too far where Lynn started us off. That hyperpartisanship, the country was fragile.
Yeah, I guess there's a cynical view you could take of that, and at some level hypocrisy. It's like, who wants to dismantle the federal government that you're now in charge of?
Right.
Yes. Well, that's certainly true. I think, first of all, once you're in charge, suddenly the federal government doesn't seem so bad.
Right.
And I think, second, he also realizes that once you're in charge, the weight of the responsibility. You say, it's easy to criticize John Adams as president, but
it's slightly more complicated than he was given it credit for before.
Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult, and I think that's right, Isaac. But I think reread that first inaugural address. I think it is a very heartfelt, and it's always been. I think historians have often treated it, as you say, a little bit cynically, a little bit. Jefferson, easy to say that because you won. I think it was really somewhat heartfelt, and they really do realize the nation is fragile. And it's not until we get to the Missouri Compromise and the fire bell in the night as Jefferson says, that we suddenly get this return to a radical states' rights movement, which then becomes the nullification crisis in the 1820s.
Right.
Now, just I'm a little confused in the timeline here, as far as just forgive me for. Well, I'm not going to admit that I'm a little confused. For those who are confused listening right now, maybe as far as when Jefferson was running for president, so the contested election, and so this all takes place prior to that, the entirety of that election process, right?
Right, Isaac. No, it's good to take a half step back.
Yeah.
So, Alien and Sedition Act, 1798.
Sure.
So 1798, John Adams is president. The Federalists control both the presidency and Congress. And you come out with the Alien and Sedition Act. And they start throwing people in jail almost immediately, especially Democratic, Republican newspaper editors. Jefferson and Madison they draft the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions at the end of 1798. And again, they're talking about nullification. And then in December and into January, February, March of 1799 is when we start seeing the backlash. George Washington writes Patrick Henry in January of 1799 and says, these people, he's talking about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, are going to destroy the country. They're going to destroy the Union. Will you please come out of retirement to help save the Union? And then Jefferson's election is 1800. It's a year later.
It's a full year later, right? Okay.
It's a full year later. Both Washington and Henry die in 1799 before Henry can take office. The other confusing thing about the timeline is the midterm elections were different back then than they are now, because Congress doesn't meet until December of the year. Their session would begin in December. So the midterm elections are occurring exactly in this time frame we're talking about, sort of December through April of 1799. And that's when they say, once Henry and Washington come out and people start to say, Jefferson and Madison, it's going to be a civil war. They're going to destroy the Union. The midterm elections, which occur in 1799, not 1798, go very, very badly against them. And then with Henry and Washington dead, the election for presidency is sort of 1800. And that's when you see Madison and Jefferson really talking a very different story.
Yeah, I was curious, is if you're looking at what events took place during that time period, what is the tempering experience? What sort of cools off that hot iron that they had to make them pull back? And, I guess the midterms potentially, even just Washington and Henry coming out to speak and seeing what the reactions to that.
Well, I think the midterms have a huge impact. And then, but in fairness to Madison writes that letter before the midterms. So even before the midterms start, I think Madison and Jefferson and Madison have an interesting relationship. Jefferson is the ideas guy, right. But Jefferson is often cautioned by Madison. Madison is a much more careful lawyer than Thomas Jefferson, even though he was not trained in the law. He is, after all, the father of the Constitution. So I think it's Madison just thinking about this and thinking about those Kentucky resolutions and starting to see the newspaper accounts, because the newspaper accounts are starting to come out that Kentucky and Virginia are talking about things that could destroy the Union. You see Madison really thinking about it and saying, we went too far here. And so I think that, and Jefferson takes Madison seriously. For Madison to write that letter, Jefferson does not ignore that. And so then when these midterm elections come out and when Henry and Washington come out, I think you see this very dramatic pulling back. And as I said, you don't see, if you look at the election material from 1800 into 1801, people aren't talking about states' rights. In 1798, Jefferson says states' rights, that's going to be our banner. That disappears. They're talking about free speech. They're talking about freedom of the press. They're talking about the federal government's too large. Those things that we associate with Jefferson. But they really pull back from this idea of states' rights because they realize that no, the Union, again, that first inaugural address, what does he say? The Union is the anchor of our salvation. Right. They realize the Union's more important and more fragile where Lynn started us out, more fragile than we had thought.
Well, it's just very interesting that it's sort of it. You hear echoes, or I guess pre-echoes, of the Civil War when you're talking about union, because that becomes sort of the cry during the 1861 Civil War, where Lincoln, it's about union, it's about union. And it seems like for Patrick Henry, it was essentially the same. It's about union. We can disagree about all of these things about laws and how big the government is, but we need to stick together with this union.
I think that's right. And I think the other aspect for Henry is the idea of representation, because he says again at that March speech in 1799, he says, look, I opposed this. I was an anti-federalist. I told you not to do it. But back to this, we the people agreed. And Henry says, look, that's the way it works. And Jefferson says this in his first inaugural address. What's the first rule in a democracy? The majority rules. What's the second rule? Jefferson specifically says, but the minority has equal rights.
Right.
I think Henry is adding sort of a third rule. The minority must accept the first rule. Sure. The minority must accept the majority rules, at least until the next election. That's the way it works.
Right.
You lose, but you go to the next election and then you try to win then. But when you lose an election, you've got to accept the results.
Right.
Imagine that in 1799.
Right.
Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful thing to state, especially given, and this is hard to think about in context now, because all of our elections have been contested for 250 years, or 200, a little less than 250 years. But that was the first one. The first contested election was really that's the peaceful transfer of power mattered. Right, they had just gone through the first, about to go through one where George Washington isn't there anymore. That they're sort of unmoored from the safe comforts of where they used to be, and gotta figure out all this stuff on their own.
Right, and I mean the irony is, there's a lot of irony here. First of all, the irony that it's Patrick Henry, the leading anti-federalist, the leading states' rights guy, who's saying, "Look, you got to live with the results of the election." But then the other irony that struck me, and I should have realized this early, I came to it fairly late in writing the book. If Henry had lived, and of course we can always play games with alternative history, but if Henry had lived, I think John Randolph of Roanoke is correct. Jefferson would have lost. John Adams would have won. That raises an interesting issue, because if Jefferson loses and Adams wins, does Jefferson flip again and go back to the radical states' rights?
Right.
And might we have had the Civil War? It really is a remarkable confluence of events that occurs in this 2 or 3 years period. That's why I say this crisis, and as we were talking about earlier, we've forgotten about this crisis. This crisis with the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, the threat to union, Washington and Henry, and then they both die and Jefferson wins, but luckily Jefferson pulls back. There were so many times here where if things had happened differently, who knows?
Yeah. Huh. Who knew that Washington dying may have been one of the last things he did to save the Union again at the right time?
Yeah, I tell people someday I'm going to write a historical novel where Jefferson knocks them off. Both Henry, isn't it convenient that both Henry and Washington died? I did not. Jefferson had nothing to do with it.
You see Jefferson meeting up with Washington on that ride, coughing on him, riding away.
Handing him a blanket.
Yeah,
where was that blanket?
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
But it really was remarkable. And Isaac, as you said, the peaceful transfer of power. For 200 years, the American Republic depended upon that peaceful transfer of power. And it was all part of this realizing that, look, that's the way it works in a democracy. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose.
Yeah, so but you always say congratulations at the end of that, and whoever it is. So
through grit and teeth. Yeah.
Now, of course, John Adams. Adams was a bit peeved. He left Washington without attending the inauguration. Only the first of two presidents who've ever done that. But he didn't stand in the way of the new government taking taking hold.
Right.
Jefferson and Madison, with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, were effectively standing in the way of the Federalist majority that had been elected to Congress. They were elected. They won the election. And Jefferson and Madison are saying, well, no, the states are going to interfere with that. So, this idea of, no, you accept the results of the election, we think that that's foundational, but it was really something they had to learn.
So I think this is in this time period, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I remember finding a letter from Jefferson to Madison. I think it was in the Jefferson papers. And it was one of those ones that I'll never forget because I was just completely stunned by what it said. And it could have been tongue in cheek, it's Jefferson. But essentially, Jefferson says to Madison, essentially pray for Patrick Henry to die. So he's looking toward the future and what they can do, which also just is very suspicious. But I just remember reading that and thinking,
Hey, you didn't want to be Jefferson's enemy. No,
right?
he was. He could be vicious. But no, Lynn, this is actually an important point that we haven't gotten into. That letter is from Jefferson's actually minister to France when he writes that letter.
Okay.
And that was about trying to reform the Virginia Constitution. But Jefferson hates Patrick Henry. Jefferson really hates Somebody told me, you can't say that about Thomas Jefferson. I said, no, but it's true. Let's devoutly pray for his death.
Right.
He's all tongue with neither head nor heart. Jefferson does have a way with words.
Yeah.
He's all tongue with neither head nor heart. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. He says that Patrick Henry despised George Washington. And again, we know that's absolutely ridiculous. And this has an effect. We can come back to why Jefferson hates Henry. But this is one of the things that has an effect because Henry dies in 1799. Jefferson lives to 1826. And he's still complaining about Patrick Henry up to the day he dies. I mean, he reads Daniel Webster like in 1822, 1823, and he's complaining about Patrick Henry is terrible. He's a terrible lawyer. He didn't know anything. And he's really denigrating Henry. So much so that Edward Pollard, there's a name that, again, wait a minute, Edward Pollard, that's the guy, he's an unrepentant Confederate. He's the author of The Lost Cause that creates this myth that the Confederacy was all about protecting states' rights, had nothing to do with slavery. That Edward Pollard, in the 1870s, writes an essay trashing Patrick Henry because of what we've been talking about, that Henry came out against states' rights and the idea of nullification. So this attack on Patrick Henry that starts with Jefferson in the 1780s and continues all through the 1790s and then up through the 1820s and then into the 1870s, this eventually has an effect. And I think this is one of the reasons why the only thing anybody knows about Patrick Henry is give me liberty or give me death. And that's been twisted into this radical libertarian, down with government regulation idea, which, again, what we've been discussing shows that's just not Patrick Henry.
Right.
So I do think that's had an effect on this episode. And one of the reasons we don't remember this episode is because Patrick Henry's memory, they tried to erase it. When Henry dies, he was the first governor of the state of Virginia. He was governor 5 times. He led Virginia through the Revolution. There's a motion made in the Virginia General Assembly to bring in a bust of Patrick Henry and put it in the Virginia General Assembly. It's defeated by the Jeffersonians. They don't want even a bust of Patrick. I mean, it's vicious to try to downplay Patrick Henry, and Jefferson's really behind it. Now, why? Jefferson had been sort of an acolyte of Patrick Henry. Henry was older. Henry is in the legislature first. Jefferson talks about Patrick Henry seemed to me to speak as Homer wrote. This is high praise.
Yeah.
But Jefferson becomes the second governor of the state of Virginia. And he has the misfortune to be governor when the British invade, when the Redcoats invade. And you'll recall that the Virginia legislature is chased out of Richmond to Charlottesville by the Redcoats, by Benedict Arnold. And then they're chased out of Charlottesville to Stanton by Bannister Tarleton, bloody Bannister Tarleton, while Jefferson is governor. Well, Jefferson's term expires, He's technically no longer governor, but they haven't appointed a new governor yet. And so when the Redcoats chase the legislature from Charlottesville, the legislature goes to Stanton, Virginia, across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Jefferson flees to his country home down near Lynchburg, Poplar Forest, and seems to abandon the state. There is no governor. And so when the legislature meets in Stanton, they launch an investigation of Jefferson's governorship, basically accusing him of incompetence, cowardice, dishonor. And Jefferson blames Patrick Henry for the investigation. Now, historians, by the way, differ as to whether Henry was behind the investigation or not. It's not clear on the record. I think he probably was, but it doesn't matter. Jefferson believes that Patrick Henry is behind. Jefferson writes James Monroe, "This has inflicted a wound on my spirit that will only be healed by the all-healing grave." Again, even for Jefferson.
Let's be dramatic.
Yeah, but but I think it's real. I mean, he's an 18th century gentleman. He's been accused of cowardice. He's been accused of dishonor. And so he is a bitter, bitter opponent of Patrick Henry from 1781 on. In fact, I tell, and again, we don't know for sure, but this is curious. They're politicians too. There's a lot of, there's back and forth. When the Constitution comes out of the Philadelphia Convention, Jefferson's in Paris. He's minister to France. And Madison knows that Jefferson may not be thrilled with this Constitution. Jefferson's a states' rights guy, and this is going to create a new powerful government. So Madison sends the Constitution to Jefferson, and Jefferson, of course, famously says there's some things I like, some things I don't like. One of the first things that Madison tells Jefferson is Patrick Henry's going to oppose it. And, I'm sorry. I mean, Madison's a smart guy. I think that was important. He says, look, I know that Jefferson hates Patrick Henry. If Patrick Henry's in opposition, that may be the best argument I have for Thomas Jefferson. You should support the Constitution.
So funny.
So that's the kind of personal political conflict that's going on among these folks. We think of them as these marble statues. No, they were politicians.
If the way you described that line that can only be healed by the
healing grave.
All healing grave. If Jefferson had been a teenager in the 90s, early 2000s, he would have written some wonderful poetry.
Maybe a song or two.
Upset, like dressed in all black with an emo haircut.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine being one of his parents. He's at it again.
Gosh.
And he's, we think about Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, and they, of course, go at it as well. But I tell people, Jefferson dislikes Alexander Hamilton. He hates Patrick Henry. He understands that his dispute with Hamilton was political. They disagreed on how you do things. The dispute with Henry was personal. And, this is an important lesson for us with the founders. They had these personal likes and dislikes. They were people. Sometimes they didn't get along. Sometimes they disliked each other. That's reality.
So can I share my theory on why they hated each other?
Sure.
Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, he was I guess you would call him a book nerd, and so he studied law under George Wythe. And he would be the lawyer who would have all of the precedents. He would be able to name all the cases, all the laws, all of that. Not a very good public speaker. Patrick Henry learned a little bit about the law, read a little bit of Blackstone, went to Williamsburg, and somehow got some guys to agree to give him a law degree, to pass the bar. So he didn't go to law school. He didn't study under anyone. And I remember one thing that Jefferson said is that he would listen to Henry talk for, it could be hours, just completely enraptured with his voice and, his tone. But then when he was done, he had no idea what he just said. And so I always feel like there's this personal kind of jealousy that Jefferson simply didn't. He believed in facts, using the cases, knowing the precedents, whereas Patrick Henry was like the guy chasing ambulances. Who will he's gonna convince the jury that the sky is down and the ground is up, because I don't think Jefferson could do that. And I think that's kind of how it started. That's my theory. I'm not a lawyer,
Well,
but I feel like
you
that
know,
creates some jealousy.
yeah. No, Lynn, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Jefferson is a good lawyer, but he's a good technical lawyer.
Right.
Henry is just unbeatable in front of the jury. He's actually a good lawyer, too. I mean, Jefferson says his legal reasoning is not worth a copper. But, Robert Carter Nicholas, when he retires from the law, offers Patrick Henry his law practice. Robert Carter Nicholas does not do that to somebody who's incompetent.
Right.
He's clearly a very capable lawyer, but he does have that ability. And I mean, there's these wonderful stories about Patrick Henry in front of the juries and how he'd be able to, he could get a jury to agree to anything. And I think you're right. I think Jefferson. But the other aspect of that is, again, go back to their earlier relationship. Henry is in the legislature. He's making that speech against the Stamp Act in 1765. Caesar had his Brutus, basically, threatening regicide. Thomas Jefferson's in the audience listening. And that's when he talks about, he seemed to me to speak as Homer wrote. He's enraptured by Patrick Henry. He's the young guy, and Henry is sort of the leader of the young patriots, the guys who are going to stir things up. And so he's really a Henry devotee initially. But, no one falls further than the idols of our youth.
Good point.
And so when Henry, I think you're right, Jefferson's like, he wins these legal cases just because he enraptures the jury, and I can't do that. And I'm not sure I like it anyway. So, yeah, I think that doesn't help.
That's interesting. That's an interesting distinction between sort of like technical political machinations and political rhetoric. And I think it's interesting that even the Madison backing off of what they, as far as nullification, backing away from that so quickly. It's odd that two guys who lived through sort of like the everyone getting riled up in the lead up to the revolution are sort of surprised that, firebrand like political rhetoric could whip people up into a frenzy and it could lead to potential violence. If they saw.
No, and your point is also well taken about the Madison and Jefferson relationship. I mean, Madison, and we think of Madison sort of being this boring guy. The people at Montpelier assure me, no, he wasn't boring. He's really an interesting guy. But he's much more of a technical political guy, a technical legal guy. He's really looking at it. And both Jefferson and Henry are ideas guys. They have these visions and come up with these ideas. And, so recognizing that about them as well. And the same is true today. I mean, we see this among politicians today, of course, and this maybe take us back to where Lynn started, talking about the election in 1800 versus the election today. Things have changed. We have social media. We have, the internet. We have people trying to interfere with the election from overseas. We have gerrymandering. And so the power of that political rhetoric in some ways has maybe gotten worse.
Sure.
And, people would listen to Madison, this calm, intellectual, political voice at that time. And, I think we need some more James Madisons, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting that dynamic between sort of like the ideas or the sort of like the public-facing rhetorical-minded person versus the technocrat. I've heard that as the reasoning why a lot of countries in their governmental systems have a prime minister and a president. Like you have one technocrat and then one sort of like guy that's given all the speeches. And you sort of separate those two roles. They're one of, there's a number of countries that are like us, but one of less so that only has one person that sort of plays both roles.
Yeah, no, most of the developed countries, most of our allies, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, they have prime ministers. And the idea is although keep in mind, that's what the Electoral College was supposed to do.
Right.
It doesn't really work that way in some ways. And by the way, the Electoral College is related to the Henry Jefferson story. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the Electoral College was supposed to be a screen, so you have these more statesman-like people to pick the president. But it hasn't worked out that way.
Sure.
And the prime minister tends to work better because rather than being directly elected, they're elected by the legislature. But this is part of what's happening with Jefferson and Henry. When they come up with the Electoral College, they had not anticipated the idea of winner take all. And Madison, there was actually a proposed constitutional amendment. Madison proposes a constitutional amendment to insist that the Electoral College vote be by district. And if that happened, that means that the electoral votes in each state would be split. So Virginia might give, 10 votes to Jefferson, 9 votes to Adams. Or,
so you mean winner take all by state? So each state is going to go by the majority. Okay, interesting.
Right. So each state, but that starts in 1796, and that really accelerates for the election of 1800. And that's really, we're getting a little bit into the weeds now, but it's relevant to our current circumstances. That's why John Randolph of Roanoke says Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected, because in the legislature that Patrick Henry was supposed to serve, he's elected in March of 1799. The legislature meets in November. He dies in June. Okay, so he doesn't go. It's that November Virginia legislature adopts winner-take-all electoral college system in Virginia. And if Virginia had thrown a few votes to John Adams, wouldn't have taken many, you would have had a different result in the presidential election. So they were learning how to manipulate the electoral college system even then.
I hadn't even thought about it. I guess it makes sense, because isn't there still one state that's proportional? I forget.
Yeah,
but
both Nebraska and Maine.
Nebraska
and Maine have districts, and Madison says we never even imagined winner take all. That never came up, and so he proposes an amendment saying you have to vote by district. Now, if we had that, now we have also the problem of gerrymandering, which they also had not thought about. Sure. But you'd have a situation where it'd be far more difficult to have someone win the popular vote but lose the general election. Now that's happened several times in the last 20 years, and they just hadn't fully thought through this electoral college system.
Oh, it's interesting. There you go. Patrick Henry being pivotal to the largest, most most important state adopting that system, and who knows if it gets adopted everywhere else.
Where would we be if he had lived? Another 6 months.
Yeah, and it's clear because it sort of comes up in the ratification debates, and Henry during ratification debates is saying, look, it's very important that your representatives, and he's including electors in that, people to the electoral college. He says it's very important that they know who you are and that they be part of the local community. It's because he wanted to have a much larger Congress. He thought the congressional districts were far too large. Of course, he would be dumbfounded today. What do we have? 600,000 people in a congressional district. So he says it's important that the electors know their people. So he clearly would have opposed this idea of winner-take-all elections. He wanted electors to actually be from the district where they're elected. So, that electoral college change, and that would have been a little bit more like the parliamentary system you're talking about. So this is one of the things. Now, I don't want to be too critical of the current system, but we need to understand that, the power of speech, the power of social media, the power of a demagogue potentially to have an impact.
I think it's, regardless of whether we're speaking critically or praising, I think it's important to think of the system as built upon a series of choices, not something that just sprung forth from, Zeus's head.
Or from,
these words.
Lightning from the earth, like Washington sprung forth.
Yeah, exactly. Understanding that it was made because of a series of choices that were done within a particular context with external factors based on what was happening at the time. Is always important to remember.
Yeah, and they thought that it was going to be amended much more. I mean, we get the first 12 amendments in the first 12 years, first 13 years, I suppose. And then suddenly it gets much more difficult to get amendments. Jefferson makes it clear that he thought the Constitution was going to be amended much more regularly. Now, There's a lot of reasons why it's not being amended, but as you say, it's not a sacred document. Jefferson at one point says we should not look on these documents. He's talking about the U.S. Constitution with sanctimonious reverence. He's talking about the U.S. Constitution, and he says, "Look, it's as you say. It was just guys. We wrote it, and we made mistakes. We're just people. So yeah, we need to understand that it was the circumstances of their time. It was the best they could do at the time, and we."
Like what you said with Patrick Henry, it's that they all want the same, believe in the same sort of core values and virtues. It's really, all of these specifics are about execution and implementation of those ideas and what's best for how to accomplish, and build that society.
And that's a much better way to put it, Isaac. And again, I think that's what Jefferson's saying in that first inaugural address. What unites us is more important than what divides us. When I do tours at Monticello, which I did until recently, I would talk about Jefferson's fundamental principles. And he talks about this, puts it on his tombstone: political freedom, religious freedom, and public education. And I would tell guests, I say, look, people say the country's divided. You're not going to find any Americans who disagree with the fact that we need solid political freedom, we need religious freedom, and we need good public education. We're going to argue about how you do it.
Right.
That's what you do in a democracy, but we really agree on the necessity of these fundamental principles. And Jefferson and Henry. Excuse me?
Or at least we should.
Yeah, we should. I think on those really fundamentals we do. Just realizing that it's all of these things that were happening in the 1790s are the same issues we're grappling with now. What happens when you lose an election? How are you a loyal opposition? How do we have a transition of power? How do we manipulate the electoral college?
Yep. Yeah.
So I think
people got into it.
I think the radical statement that you're telling us is that to know your history makes you a better citizen today. Am I crazy, or is that what we're thinking?
No, Lynn, absolutely. And in two ways, and I think they're both important. The one is the misuse of history. And again, Isaac talks about the T-shirts with Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty, give me death," which really misrepresent what Henry was all about.
It does.
These protests at January 6th, people were, wearing Patrick Henry T-shirts. Really misrepresents Henry. But then the second part, Lynn, of what you're saying is absolutely true as well, that if we understand how this started, how they developed this system, how they had problems, how they argued about it, we start realizing it's our responsibility.
Right.
Again, Jefferson is famous in that regard, saying every generation has to decide for itself. And it's understanding that history. What it ultimately should do is help us today figure out how do you work this system that we're trying to live under.
Right.
Yeah.
To not know history is to repeat history. And if you don't know history, you repeat it, and historians sit back and weep as we watch everyone repeating it and not learning.
So that's the takeaway. Read some more, listen to historians so you don't make them upset.
That's right. Yes, first and foremost. Yeah. But after that, learn about our government.
Well, right, and don't again, Jefferson's terms, don't have sanctimonious reverence for these documents. The other thing that I think I mentioned that Patrick Henry says in that March 1799 speech that I think is so important is he says, "Look, it's our Congress. It's not them. We elected them. Now, I may have voted against my congressman. As a matter of fact, I did. But he's still my congressman. He's there because the majority of the people in my district elected him." And, that's such an obvious point, but that's really a powerful point that we sometimes forget. And I don't have to agree with him. I can oppose my congressman. I can write him letters saying, I wish you would do X, Y, and Z. But it's my Congress. Unless I don't vote, which that's my fault. But it's our Congress, it's our government. And, Henry says, look, the Congress is as much our representatives as the state legislature is our representatives. So we have to accept what the majority decides.
Yeah, that's what it means to be part of a republic.
Yeah, well put.
I think that's a great, a thought to leave with our listeners, to put a button on this conversation
and,
about,
of course, to
Patrick Henry. Go ahead,
buy
Lynn.
the book.
Yes,
for the people,
yes,
for the
that's
country,
a good thing too.
Because if this was so much fun, this is fascinating, right? So why not learn more about it? There's a whole book about it. It's fascinating.
Yeah, the book is called For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. And John, I know you're an independent historian now. Is there anywhere, if people are interested in your scholarship, where they can find you? Do you post on socials? Do you have a blog or anything like that?
Yes, I do have a website, johnaRagosta.com. And I've had a lot of opportunities. I really appreciate the opportunity today, Lynn and Isaac, but I've had a lot of opportunities to speak about this. I'll be speaking about it at Yorktown in July.
Nice.
I'll be speaking at Colonial Williamsburg and St. John's Church in Richmond in October.
Fabulous.
Speaking in Dallas in November. And I I made an appointment to speak in Dallas the week after the election. I'm not. I don't know whether that was the smartest thing I've ever done. But
might be.
Well, it may be. But it's we all remember from high school and then college. People say, "Oh, I hate history." This history is us. It's about our country. It's about our nation. And it's abused. Back to the 2 points, we need to understand when people are abusing the history, and we also need to understand the history so that we can act better as citizens and the way things operate. So I'm always happy to go somewhere and talk about this important story.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in near any of those places, just check out John's website. What was it? Is it John Ragosta?
John A. Ragosta. My middle initial is A. JohnARagosta.com. But I'm easy to find.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes as well, so you'll be able to find it there. But if you're nearby, please go to one of the speaking engagements. It'll be a wonderful thing, especially if you're in Dallas post the election.
Absolutely.
But, and as always, all of these episodes are supported by our or sponsored by our supporters over on patreon.com. So if you enjoyed this and you want to see us do more interviews with historians like Dr. Ragosta, please go to patreon.com/primary source media to check it out. Our free tier gives you access to our Discord, where there's a bunch of like-minded history fans and some of the historians that we interviewed just chatting and asking interesting historical questions. And then our paid tiers give you all sorts of exclusive content and some book giveaways, which we may be giving away a copy of John's book in the near future. So please go check that out for that. That's patreon.com/primary source media. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow us on wherever you find your social media. We're on all of them. Sorry to have you sit through the plugs there. But thank you so much for being here. This is a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Isaac. It's a wonderful chance to have a chat to chat about this and to get different perspectives.
Yeah, always.
Awesome.